The whispers of Pinehaven Village carried across the morning mist like prayers never meant to be answered. Olivia Sullivan drew her faded woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked alone. Dirt path past Miller's General Store, past the white-steepled church with its judgmental bell tower, past the rows of homes where curtains twitched and quickly closed at the sight of her. 4 babies lost, a husband dead, and a town that had decided she was marked by something darker than misfortune. This was the woman they called cursed, yet one man would soon call her his only blessing and hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early autumn wind bit through Olivia's thin dress as her boots crunched over fallen leaves. 5 years she had lived in this small valley town, and now 5 years she had walked these streets alone. The townsfolk's whispers followed her like shadows. Bad luck follows that woman like winter follows fall, their eyes averting when she glanced their way. Their children ushered to the opposite side of the street when they spotted her approach. Today was no different as she made her way to the edge of town, where her small cottage stood apart from the others like an afterthought, its stone chimney rarely smoking these days to conserve what little firewood she could afford. The cottage had become both sanctuary and prison since Edward's death, a place where she could escape the stairs, but where silence pressed against her with suffocating weight. The last of the 4 small graves had been dug in Pinehaven Cemetery just 8 months ago. Little Rebecca had lived 6 days longer than her siblings before her, long enough for Olivia to count her tiny fingers, to stroke the wisp of golden hair so like Edward's, to whisper promises of love and protection that her body ultimately couldn't keep. The doctor had shaken his head, muttering about weak lungs and God's mysterious ways, while the midwife crossed herself and wouldn't meet Olivia's eyes. By the 3rd baby, the town had already decided. By the 4th, even the pastor's wife wouldn't accept Olivia's embroidery work. The curse is in her hands, Mrs. Blackwood had whispered loudly enough for Olivia to hear as she left the church auxiliary meeting. Everything she touches withers. Poor Edward, working that dangerous logging job to pay for doctors who couldn't save their babies. No wonder the Lord took him too. Edward Sullivan had died in a logging accident 11 months after their 4th baby was buried. A tree had fallen wrong, the foreman had explained awkwardly on her doorstep, hat in hand. The men had been clearing a new section of forest at the valley's edge when the massive pine had suddenly split and crashed in an unexpected direction. He didn't suffer, Mrs. Sullivan, the foreman had said, though the way his eyes shifted told her otherwise. What the foreman didn't say, but the town whispered freely, was that Edward had been distracted, sleepless from grief, and perhaps careless because of it. What they added in hushed tones over Sunday dinners was that Olivia's curse had followed him into the forest, turned the tree against him, stolen him as it had stolen their children. Now, as Olivia approached her cottage, she caught sight of her reflection in the small window beside the door. A woman just 28 years old, whose green eyes held the weariness of someone twice her age. Her auburn hair, once Edward's pride, hung limply around a face grown gaunt with grief and meager meals. The dress she wore had been let out, then taken in, then let out again with each pregnancy, and now hung loosely on her diminished frame. Inside, the cottage was neat but sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, though one never held a visitor. A hearth with hooks for cooking pots. A bed with a patchwork quilt she'd made during her first pregnancy, and a chest containing what remained of her life before including 4 tiny gowns never worn for more than a few days. Olivia lit a small fire, just enough to take the chill from her bones, and set about making tea from the herbs she'd gathered from her garden. The garden was her one remaining joy, wild and untamed at the edges were raspberry bushes and morning glories had been allowed to spread as they wished, but methodical near the cottage where she grew vegetables and herbs. Somehow, despite what the town believed about her touch bringing death, her garden thrived. "They say even weeds won't grow in cursed soil," old Mrs. Finch had remarked loudly when passing Olivia's cottage one spring day. "Those plants must not know what's tending them." But the plants did grow, and in their silent company, Olivia found the only peace her life now offered. This late in the season, the garden had yielded its final harvest: carrots with earth still clinging to their orange flesh, potatoes nestled like treasures in the dark soil, onions with tops just beginning to yellow and bend. She had gathered them all, more than she could eat alone, and they sat in baskets near the door. As Olivia sipped her tea, her eyes drifted to those baskets. There was something almost obscene about such abundance in a house marked by loss. She thought of the coming winter, how the town would hunker down against the snow, families gathering close around hearths, sharing stories and meals while she sat alone in her cottage, with more food than one person needed, yet less human warmth than anyone deserved. An idea formed slowly, tentatively, like the first green shoot breaking through snow-covered ground. Beyond the northern ridge that bordered Pinehaven Valley, separated by a steep, winding path rarely traveled these days, stood a farmhouse. Olivia had glimpsed it sometimes on clear days when she ventured to the highest point of her garden, a solitary structure with fields surrounding it that had once been well tended, but now seemed to be returning to the wild. The man who lived there had a name the town rarely spoke: Gabriel Rhodes. He had come to Pinehaven Valley 6 years ago with a pretty wife named Claire, whose laughter had carried across the fields when she thought no one could hear. They had planned to raise sheep on the highland pastures, to build a life away from the city where Claire had grown up. But the winter of their 3rd year had brought fever to the valley, and while most had recovered, Claire Rhodes had not. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Since then, Gabriel Rhodes had become almost as much of a ghost in Pinehaven as Olivia. He came to town rarely, only when supplies couldn't be postponed any longer. When he did appear, he kept his head down, his business brief, his words few. Tall and broad-shouldered from years of farm work, with dark hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, he moved through town like a man walking under water, present, but separate, surrounded by an isolation as palpable as Olivia's own. They had never spoken, she and this widower from the ridge. But sometimes when their paths crossed in town, when she felt the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides, she had caught his eye briefly. In that fleeting connection, she had sensed neither pity nor fear, only recognition, the wordless acknowledgement of one broken soul to another. Standing at her cottage window now, looking toward the northern ridge where clouds gathered around the mountaintop, Olivia made a decision that would alter the course of her life, though she couldn't know it then. She would take some of her garden's bounty to Gabriel Rhodes, not out of pity, but out of the simple human understanding that grief was easier to bear when its weight was recognized by another. The steep path to the Ridge farm hadn't been maintained since Gabriel Rhodes stopped regularly coming to town. Brambles had begun to encroach from the sides, and in places, rain had carved small gullies that made footing treacherous. Olivia picked her way carefully, the basket of vegetables heavy on her arm, her breath coming in small clouds in the cooling afternoon air. The climb took longer than she had anticipated. By the time she crested the final rise and the farmhouse came into view, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks to the west. The farmhouse itself was larger than she had imagined from her distant glimpses. 2 stories of weathered wood with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A stone chimney released a thin tendril of smoke into the darkening sky. Unlike the untended fields, the yard immediately surrounding the house showed signs of care. Firewood was stacked neatly against the side of a small barn. The path from the road was clear of weeds, and the porch steps had been recently repaired. Windows gleamed clean in the late sunlight, and a lantern already burned in one downstairs. Window Olivia hesitated at the edge of the yard, suddenly uncertain. What had seemed like a simple gesture of human kindness now felt presumptuous. Who was she to intrude on this man's solitude? What would he think of the cursed woman from the valley bringing food to his door? Before she could retreat, the front door opened. Gabriel Rhodes stood framed in the doorway, a tall figure backlit by the warm glow of a fire inside. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Olivia swallowed, gathering her courage. "Mr. Rhodes." Neither spoke for a long moment. The wind rustled through the pine trees surrounding the property, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. "I brought vegetables from my garden," Olivia said finally, lifting the basket slightly. "More than I can use before they spoil." Gabriel's eyes moved from her face to the basket and back again. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken understanding. "That's kind of you," he said at last, stepping aside. "Slightly. Would you like to come in? It's getting dark, and the path can be dangerous after sunset." The invitation surprised them both, it seemed. Gabriel looked as though the words had emerged without his conscious decision. Olivia hesitated, thinking of the town below, of the whispers that would surely follow if anyone knew she had visited a widower's home alone, had accepted his hospitality as night fell. Then she thought of her empty cottage, the silence that awaited her there, the long night ahead with only memories for company. "Yes," she said simply. "Thank you." The interior of the farmhouse was spare but clean, warmer than Olivia had kept her own cottage in months. A fire burned steadily in a stone hearth, casting dancing light across walls lined with bookshelves. The furniture was simple but well crafted, a wooden table with 4 chairs, though only one showed signs of regular use. A desk beneath the window with papers neatly stacked. A rocking chair pulled close to the fire with an open book face down on its seat. "I've just made coffee," Gabriel said, moving toward the kitchen area. "Would you like some?" "Yes, please," Olivia replied, still standing uncertainly just inside the door, the basket of vegetables heavy on her arm. "You can set those down," he said, nodding toward a counter. "And your shawl too, if you'd like. It's warm enough in here." As Olivia placed the basket down and unwound her shawl from her shoulders, she became acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd been inside someone else's home. How long since she'd accepted hospitality from anyone. The simple act of removing her shawl in this man's house felt intimate in a way that made her cheeks warm slightly. Gabriel poured coffee into 2 earthenware mugs, added a splash of cream to both without asking her preference, and brought them to the table. "Please sit," he said, pulling out a chair. Olivia sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The rich aroma of the coffee rose between them, stronger and more flavorful than the weak brew she typically made to stretch her. "Supplies. It's good," she said after taking a sip. "I haven't had coffee this strong in a while," Gabriel nodded. "One of the few luxuries I allow myself." They drank in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Olivia noticed that Gabriel's hands, though large and marked by years of farm work, held his mug with a certain gentleness. The same hands that stacked firewood with military precision also turned pages of books with care. "I should explain why I came," Olivia said finally. "You don't need to," Gabriel replied, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she'd entered his home. "It's enough that you did." Something in his gaze steady, unafraid. Seeing her without judgment made Olivia's carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "No one in town will take food from me anymore," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "They think I'm cursed, that anything I touch will bring misfortune." Gabriel's expression didn't change. "I've heard the talk." "Anne, you're not afraid?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Of what? A woman with a garden that grows better than mine? His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile but close. No, Mrs. Sullivan, I'm not afraid of you. Olivia, she said. Please call me Olivia. Olivia, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. I'm Gabriel. Another silence fell between them, but it felt different now, like a space opening. Up rather than a barrier. How long has it been since you've had a visitor, Gabriel? Olivia asked, glancing around the well-kept but solitary home. He considered the question seriously. 3 years, I think. The doctor came once when I took ill with pneumonia. Before that. He shrugged. I can't recall. Don't you get lonely up here? Every day, he answered with a directness that caught her off guard. But lonely is better than being around people who look at you with pity, who walk on eggshells, who don't know what to say, so they say nothing at all. Olivia nodded, understanding flooding through her. They think I killed them, she said. Softly, my babies, that something in me was wrong tainted. That my curse followed Edward into the forest and took him too. Gabriel's eyes never left her face. And what do you think? The question startled her. No one had ever asked what she thought, what she believed about her own life, her own losses. I think, she began, then stopped, gathering her thoughts. I think grief makes people afraid. It reminds them that terrible things can happen for no reason, that love doesn't protect us from loss. It's easier to believe I'm cursed than to accept that sometimes babies die, despite everything, that sometimes trees fall the wrong way, that life is fragile and unpredictable. Gabriel nodded slowly. When Claire died, someone in town told me. It was God's judgment because we rarely attended church services. As if a God worth believing in would kill a kind woman to punish irregular attendance. His voice was even, but Olivia could hear the old anger beneath the words. I'm sorry about your wife, Olivia said. I'm sorry about your children, Gabriel replied, and your husband. Simple words, but they touched something deep inside Olivia that had been aching for acknowledgement. Not pity, not fear, but simple recognition of her losses as losses, not as evidence of some supernatural taint. The youngest, she said, her voice catching slightly, lived for 6 days. Long enough for me to name her, to hope, Rebecca. She hadn't spoken the name aloud in months. She had the sweetest little face, like a rosebud. Gabriel reached across the table then and covered her hand with his. The touch, the first human contact she'd experienced in nearly a year that wasn't accidental or transactional, sent warmth spreading up her arm. Rebecca is a beautiful name, he said quietly. A name that means to bind, to connect, to tie firmly. Olivia looked up, surprised. You know the meaning of names? A faint color touched his cheekbones. I read, a lot. These days, books are often my only company. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending gusts against the windows and down the chimney, causing the fire to flare and dance. Gabriel glanced toward the darkened glass. The storm's coming in faster than I expected, he said. The path down to the valley won't be safe tonight. Olivia felt a flutter of alarm. I should go. Stay, Gabriel said, the word hanging between them. Then more gently, please, I have a spare room. The path is treacherous even in daylight. In darkness with rain coming, he shook his head. It would be dangerous. Olivia knew he was right. The steep path with its exposed roots and sudden drops would be perilous in darkness and doubly so in rain. And yet, the thought of spending the night in this man's home, this stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger. What would people say? She asked, though even as the words left her mouth, she realized how absurd they were. The town already shunned her, already whispered behind their hands when she passed. What more could they possibly do? Gabriel seemed to follow her thoughts. Does it matter? He asked quietly. Haven't they already said the worst? Olivia looked at him, this tall, solemn man whose life had been carved by loss just as surely as hers had been. In his storm-colored eyes, she saw neither judgment nor expectation, only a simple human kindness that had become as rare in her. "Life is laughter." "All right," she said. "Thank you." The spare room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered by a quilt that showed signs of age but had been carefully mended. A small table held a basin and pitcher, and a window looked out over the dark landscape, now obscured by rain that had begun to fall in earnest. "It was Claire's sewing room," Gabriel explained as he set a lantern on the table. "I've kept it. Just in case." Just in case of what, he didn't say, but Olivia understood. Just in case life returned to normal. Just in case the solitude became too much. Just in case a visitor needed shelter from a storm. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you. There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold," he added, lingering in the doorway. "And I'll be just down the hall if you need anything." After he left, Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain against the window and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The quilt beneath her fingers had been made by Claire Rhodes, she realized, the stitches small and even, the pattern intricate. A woman she had never met had created this beautiful thing that now offered comfort to the woman the town called cursed. There was something both sad and hopeful in that thought. As she prepared for sleep, removing her outer dress and shoes but keeping on her chemise and underskirt, Olivia found herself thinking about Gabriel. About the careful way he moved through his home, as if constantly aware of the empty spaces where another person should be. About the bookshelves lined with volumes that suggested a mind hungry for words when human conversation was lacking. About the coffee he made strong because it was one of the few pleasures he allowed himself. And about his hands, work-roughened but gentle, covering hers when she spoke her daughter's name. When she finally slipped beneath the quilt, Olivia realized it had been months since she had felt truly warm, truly safe. The rhythm of the rain, and the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone in the world, even if just for one night, lulled her toward the first peaceful sleep she had known since Edward's death. Morning arrived with tentative fingers of sunlight reaching through thinning clouds. Olivia woke disoriented at first, the unfamiliar room and the quality of light so different from her cottage below. For a moment, as consciousness returned slowly, she felt a rare sense of peace. Then memory rushed back, the climb up the mountain, the vegetables, Gabriel's invitation, the storm that had kept her here. She sat up quickly, suddenly aware of sounds from below, movement in the kitchen. The clatter of cookware, the scent of something baking. Her dress, she discovered, had been shaken out and hung carefully over the back of a chair. Her boots had been placed neatly beside the door, the mud from yesterday's climb cleaned away. Olivia dressed quickly, using the water in the basin to wash her face and smooth her hair as best she could. She felt strangely self-conscious, aware that in the harsh light of morning, Gabriel would see her more clearly than in yesterday's forgiving dusk, would see the gauntness of her face. Darned places in her dress, the gray that had begun to thread through her auburn hair, despite her young age. When she descended the narrow staircase, Gabriel was at the stove, his back to her as he tended to a pan of eggs. He had changed into clean clothes, a simple shirt and trousers, but freshly laundered. His dark hair was damp, as if he'd just washed. "Good morning," he said without turning, somehow sensing her presence. "Good morning," Olivia replied, pausing at the foot of the stairs. "You didn't have to cook for me." "You brought food," Gabriel said simply, transferring eggs to 2 plates where slices of toast already waited. It seemed a fair exchange. The table had been set for 2, she noticed. Coffee steamed in the same earthenware mugs from the night before, and a pot of wild honey sat between them. "Please sit," Gabriel said, bringing the plates to the table. As they ate, Olivia found herself studying Gabriel more carefully than she had the night before. In daylight, She could see that grief had marked him just as surely as it had marked her, in the lines around his eyes, in the slight stoop of shoulders that should have been proudly straight on a man not yet 40, in the careful economy of his movements, as if he had learned to take up less space in a world grown too large for him alone. "Thank you," she said as they finished the simple but satisfying meal. "For the food. For letting me stay." Gabriel nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his coffee. "It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Olivia countered softly. "It was kindness, and kindness has been rare in my life lately." Something flickered in Gabriel's expression, recognition, perhaps, or shared understanding. "Mine too," he admitted. They were silent for a moment, each absorbed in their own thoughts as sunlight strengthened through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between them. "I should go," Olivia said finally, though she felt a curious reluctance to leave the warmth of this kitchen, the quiet companionship of this solitary man. "People will wonder where I am." "Will they?" Gabriel asked, his voice gentle rather than challenging. The question gave her pause. Would anyone in Pinehaven notice her absence? Would anyone knock on her cottage door, concerned that she hadn't been seen in the town? The painful truth was that they might notice, might even remark upon it, but only as confirmation of their suspicions that the cursed woman had finally brought misfortune upon herself. "No," she admitted. "I suppose they won't." Gabriel studied her face, then stood and walked to the window that overlooked the valley below. "The path will still be muddy from the rain," he said. "Treacherous in places. Let me walk with you, at least part of the way." Olivia wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage alone as she had managed everything else. But the genuine concern in his voice stopped her. It had been so long since anyone had worried about her safety, had offered protection rather than distance. "All right," she said. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave, Olivia wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, Gabriel pulling on a worn jacket, he paused at the door. "Your vegetables," he said. "They're good. The carrots especially, sweet even this late in the season." "My garden grows well," Olivia replied, "despite what people say about my touch." Gabriel's mouth curved slightly. "Perhaps plants are wiser than people." The descent from the ridge was slower than the climb had been, the path slick with mud from the night's rain. In several places, Gabriel offered his hand to help Olivia across particularly treacherous stretches, and each time she accepted, the brief contact both reassuring and unsettling in its unfamiliarity. They walked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by Gabriel pointing out a hawk circling overhead or Olivia remarking on a late-blooming wildflower struggling up through the rocky soil at the path's edge. When they reached the halfway point of flat outcropping of rock that offered a view of both the ridge above and the valley below, Gabriel stopped. "I leave you here," he said. "The path is easier from this point." Olivia nodded, suddenly reluctant to part ways. Yesterday, she had been a woman isolated by grief and superstition, making an impulsive gesture of kindness to a fellow outcast. Today, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a connection, however tenuous, to another human being who saw her as she was, not as the town's whispers had painted her. "Thank you again," she said, "for everything." Gabriel looked at her for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes serious. "Will you come again?" he asked, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Olivia hesitated, thinking of the town below, of the isolation that had become both punishment and protection. Then she thought of the warmth of Gabriel's kitchen, the comfort of conversation without judgment, the simple human connection that had been denied her for so long. "Yes," she said simply, "if you'd like me to." "I would," Gabriel replied, his voice quiet but certain. As Olivia continued down the path alone, she felt something shift inside her, not hope exactly, for hope seemed too fragile a word for the ache in her chest, but perhaps a willingness to believe that life might yet hold something beyond mere endurance. That connection was still possible, even for those marked by loss. Behind her on the ridge, Gabriel Rhodes watched until she disappeared around a bend in the path. Then he turned and began the climb back to his solitary home, which somehow felt different now, as if her brief presence had awakened rooms long closed, had reminded the very walls that they had been built to shelter more than one solitary life. In Pinehaven Valley below, the whispers would continue. The cursed woman would still walk alone past shuttered windows and averted gazes. The widower on the ridge would still be the subject of occasional speculation and pity. But something had changed. A door had opened that neither could close again. A connection had formed between two broken souls that would alter the course of both their lives in ways they could not yet imagine. And in a world that had taught them both the fragility of happiness, that was miracle enough for one autumn day. The path between the ridge and Olivia's cottage became a well-worn track over the following weeks. Each visit began with an offering vegetables from her garden, bread she had baked, preserves she had put up for winter. But these simple gifts soon became pretext for what both she and Gabriel truly sought: conversation, companionship, the comfort of being seen without judgment. Their friendship grew like a hardy vine finding purchase on a stone wall, slowly at first, then with increasing strength and purpose. Each Tuesday and Friday, weather permitting, Olivia would climb the ridge path, her steps growing more confident. With every journey, Gabriel would meet her at the door, sometimes with flour dusting his hands from baking, sometimes with a book marked by his finger, as if he'd been reading while watching for her arrival. They established rituals without discussing them. Coffee in the kitchen when she arrived, regardless of the hour. Dinner prepared together, Gabriel teaching Olivia how to make the hearty stews his mother had once made, Olivia showing him how to bake bread that didn't sink in the middle. Conversation that flowed more easily with each visit, circling from everyday matters to deeper waters of memory and loss, then back to safer shores when emotions ran too high. Claire loved music, Gabriel told her one evening as they sat before the fire, the November wind rattling the windows. She played the piano beautifully. Her family had one in their home in Boston, massive thing. Couldn't bring it here, of course. Sometimes I'd wake at night and hear her humming to herself, her fingers tapping out the melody on the windowsill or the edge of the bed, as if the music was always there inside her, looking for a way out. Olivia listened, noting how Gabriel's face softened when he spoke of Claire, the way her memory lived in his voice, not as a ghost that haunted him, but as a presence that had shaped him. Edward whistled, Olivia offered in return. Constantly. Drove me half mad sometimes, especially when I was heavy with child and couldn't sleep. He'd whistle while he worked, while he walked, while he washed. Couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, but it never stopped him. Gabriel smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Were they happy? The times before the losses? The question might have seemed cruel from anyone else, but from Gabriel, it felt like an invitation to remember joy as well as sorrow. Yes, Olivia said, surprised by the certainty in her voice. Yes, they were. Edward was a good man. Not perfect, he had a temper, and he was stubborn as a mule when he thought he was right. But he loved fiercely. He would have been a wonderful father. She paused, throat tightening. He was a wonderful father for the short time he had with each of them. Gabriel's eyes held hers across the firelit room. Tell me about them, your children, if you want to. No one had ever asked Olivia about her babies before. Not as individuals, not as people she had known, however briefly. They were statistics. In town gossip, evidence of her supposed curse, tragedies to be whispered about, but never openly discussed. The invitation to speak of them as her children rather than her losses nearly undid her. The first was a boy, she began, her voice barely Above a whisper. Joseph, after Edward's father, born too early, 7 months. So tiny his hand couldn't close around my finger. He lived less than a day. Gabriel nodded, encouraging her to continue. The second and third were girls. Elizabeth and Hannah. Elizabeth's heart wasn't formed properly. The doctor could hear it when he listened with his stethoscope. Said it sounded like a bird with a broken wing trying to fly. She held on for 3 days. Hannah seemed healthy at first, but she couldn't breathe properly. Every breath was a battle she fought for 2 days before she simply had no strength left. Olivia took a deep breath, steadying herself. And Rebecca, our last, she was perfect, or seemed so. Proper weight, good color, strong cry. For 6 days we believed the curse was broken, that she would thrive. On the 7th morning, I woke to feed her and found her already gone. No warning. No struggle. The doctor called it cradle death. Said sometimes babies just stop. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they were different from the tears she had shed alone in her cottage. Not the bitter salt of isolation, but the cleansing waters of shared grief. They were loved, Gabriel said simply. Every moment they were here, they were loved completely. That matters, Olivia. It has to matter. Does it? She asked, not challenging but genuinely questioning. When the outcome is the same. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. I believe it does, he said finally. I have to believe that love is never wasted, even when it cannot save. The words settled around Olivia like a blanket, warming places inside. Her that had been cold for so long she had forgotten they could feel warmth at all. As the valley moved deeper into winter, Olivia's visits to the ridge became more intentional, requiring planning and preparation. Heavy snow made the path treacherous, sometimes impassable for days at a time. On those days, she would stand at her cottage window, looking toward the ridge where she knew Gabriel was similarly confined, and feel the ache of absence like a physical thing. When the path cleared enough for travel, their reunions took on a celebratory quality, relief and joy mingling in the way Gabriel would watch for her from his porch, in the way Olivia would quicken her steps when the farmhouse came into view. The town, of course, noticed. Olivia's twice-weekly absences, her purposeful journeys toward the ridge, her improved appearance all became fodder for renewed speculation and gossip. Seems the widow Sullivan has found herself a new prospect, Mrs. Blackwood remarked loudly as Olivia passed the church auxiliary meeting. Poor Mr. Rhodes. Doesn't know what's coming for him. She'll bury him like she buried the others, agreed Mrs. Miller, the general store owner's wife. Mark my words. Olivia heard them. They meant for her to hear, but discovered that their words no longer carried the power to wound as they once had. The connection she had found with Gabriel, the simple human dignity of being seen and valued, had formed a shield around her heart that mere gossip could not penetrate. In mid-December, a blizzard descended upon Pinehaven Valley with furious intensity, burying the town in drifts higher than a man's head and isolating households for nearly a week. Olivia had not been able to visit Gabriel for 10 days, and worry gnawed at her. Did he have enough food? Was he warm enough in that big farmhouse with only himself to tend the fires? Was he like her, standing at windows and watching for a break in the weather, feeling the weight of solitude more heavily now that he had known its alternative? When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged to create a blinding glitter across the snow-covered valley, Olivia didn't hesitate. She packed a basket with bread she had baked during her confinement, preserves from her pantry, a small cake flavored with the last of her precious vanilla and extravagance she would once have. Considered foolish but now felt essential. The journey up the ridge was arduous. In places, the snow had drifted so high she had to find ways around, extending her journey by nearly an hour. By the time the farmhouse came into view, Olivia was exhausted, her boots and the hem of her dress soaked through, her fingers numb despite her woolen gloves. But the sight of smoke rising from Gabriel's chimney, of lamplight already glowing in the windows though it was barely mid-afternoon, filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with physical comfort. She was still 20 yards from the house when the front door flew open and Gabriel emerged, hatless and without a coat despite the bitter cold, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Olivia," he called, hurrying toward her through the snow. "You shouldn't have come in this. The path must be treacherous." "I had to see that you were all right," she replied, suddenly self-conscious. "After the storm." Gabriel reached her, his eyes taking in her exhausted state, the soaked condition of her clothing. Without hesitation, he took the basket from her arm and offered his other arm for support. "Come inside," he said. "You're half frozen." The warmth of the farmhouse enveloped Olivia as they entered, making her realize just how cold she had become. During the journey, Gabriel set her basket aside and helped her remove her wet outer layers, a domestic intimacy that would have been unthinkable months ago, but now felt natural, necessary. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, leading her to the rocking chair closest to the hearth. "I'll make tea. Something stronger than tea, I think." As Olivia sank into the chair, grateful for the fire's immediate heat, she watched Gabriel move efficiently around the kitchen, heating water, finding cups, retrieving a bottle of amber liquid from a cabinet. His movements were so familiar to her now, his presence in this space so right, that something shifted inside her chest, a recognition she wasn't yet ready to name. Gabriel returned with 2 steaming mugs, fragrant with cinnamon and cloves. A generous measure of whiskey added to combat the chill. "Drink," he said, handing her one. "It will warm you from the inside." Olivia obeyed, the sweet spicy heat of the drink spreading through her chest and into her limbs, chasing away the last of the cold. Gabriel pulled the second rocking chair close to hers and sat, his own mug cradled between his large hands. "You shouldn't have risked the journey," he said again, but his tone was gentle. "The path won't be truly safe for days yet." "I was worried," Olivia admitted. 10 days is a long time." Gabriel's eyes, the color of winter skies, held hers. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "it is." They sat in companionable silence for a while, rocking gently, sipping their drinks, listening to the fire's contented crackling and the occasional drip of melting icicles outside the window. Olivia felt the tension of the difficult journey and the preceding days of isolation gradually released from her shoulders, her back, her mind. "I missed you," Gabriel said suddenly, the words falling into the quiet room like pebbles into still water. Olivia looked at him, this man who had become so essential to her life in such a short time. His face was serious, his eyes intent on hers, waiting for her response. "I missed you too," she said simply, honestly. Gabriel nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. Then he stood, setting his empty mug aside. "The snow will make it impossible for you to return to the valley before nightfall," he said. "You should stay." It wasn't the first time Olivia had stayed at the farmhouse. There had been other storms, other evenings when conversation had stretched late into the night, making the journey down the ridge inadvisable. But this felt different, a deliberate choice rather than a necessity, an acknowledgement of something growing between them that neither had yet put into words. "Yes," Olivia agreed, "I should." As evening settled over the ridge, bringing with it a renewed intensity of cold that made the windows frost and the house timbers creak, Gabriel and Olivia prepared dinner together. They moved around the kitchen with the easy coordination of people accustomed to sharing space, anticipating each other's needs, finding pleasure in the simple domestic act of creating a meal together. Over dinner, a hearty stew Gabriel had prepared during the storm, warmed now and served with Olivia's fresh bread. They talked about everything and nothing. Books Gabriel had read during the blizzard, a family of cardinals Olivia had observed, taking shelter in the eaves of her cottage, plans for spring planting, memories of winters past. It was only as they washed dishes together afterward, Olivia washing while Gabriel dried, that the conversation turned to more serious matters. "The town is talking," Olivia said, passing him a clean plate. "About us. About my visits here." Gabriel's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "I suspected they might be. They think I'll bring you misfortune," Olivia continued, keeping her eyes on the dishwater. "That my curse will claim you as it claimed Edward and the babies." Gabriel set the plate down carefully and turned to face her, waiting until she looked up to meet his gaze. "And what do you think, Olivia?" he asked quietly. The question hung between them, weighted with all they had shared and all they had not yet said. "I think," she began, then faltered, gathering courage. "I think that for the first time since Rebecca died, I've remembered what it feels like to look forward to tomorrow. To feel something besides grief and isolation. And it terrifies me." Gabriel's expression softened. "What terrifies you? The town's talk?" "No," Olivia said, the truth emerging as she spoke it. "What terrifies me is the possibility of happiness. Because I've learned how quickly it can be snatched away, how completely it can be destroyed." Gabriel stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could see the flecks of darker gray in his storm-colored eyes. "Olivia," he said, her name a caress in his voice, "do you believe you're cursed?" The question was direct, unavoidable. In the months they had known each other, through all their conversations about grief and loss, this fundamental question had remained unasked. "I don't know," she whispered. "4 babies, Gabriel. 4 perfect babies who never had a chance to live. A husband taken in his prime. What else would you call it?" Gabriel reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and cupped her face in his palm. His hand was warm against her cheek, gentle despite its strength. "I would call it unimaginable sorrow," he said. "I would call it the cruelty of a world where sometimes things go wrong for no reason we can understand. I would call it anything but a curse, because curses imply deserving, and there is nothing you could ever have done to deserve such loss." Tears filled Olivia's eyes, spilling over to wet his fingers. "Then why?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for years finally finding voice. "Why my babies? Why Edward? Why so much loss concentrated in one life?" Gabriel shook his head slightly, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't think anyone knows. But I do know this. Whatever force took your children, took your husband, it wasn't you, Olivia. It wasn't something in you that caused it." The words, spoken with such conviction, such certainty, pierced through layers of guilt and self-doubt that had accumulated around Olivia's heart. She closed her eyes, leaning into Gabriel's touch, allowing herself to absorb the possibility that he was right, that she was not the architect of her own tragedies, not the bringer of death, not cursed, but simply devastatingly unlucky. When she opened her eyes again, Gabriel was watching her with an expression she had never seen on any face directed toward her. Not pity, not fear, but something that looked remarkably like reverence. "In all the darkness you've endured," he said softly, "you've somehow remained capable of kindness, of generosity, of seeing another person's pain and reaching out across your own grief to offer comfort. If that's a curse, Olivia Sullivan, then words have lost all meaning." Then, with a gentleness that broke something open inside her, Gabriel leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. Not quite a kiss, more a benediction. "You are not cursed," he murmured against her skin. "You are the bravest soul I've ever known." That night, as snow began to fall again outside, gentle flakes replacing the blizzard's fury, Olivia lay awake in the spare room that had become hers in all but name. The quilt Claire Rhodes had made covered her, its intricate stitches connecting her to a woman she had never met, but whose absence had created the space. Olivia now occupied both in this room and in Gabriel's life. The thought should have troubled her, this sense of building something new atop the foundation of another's loss. But somehow, in the quiet honesty that night brings, it felt right, as if grief could be not only endured but transformed, as if love lost could become the soil in which new love might grow. New love. The words formed in Olivia's mind with startling clarity. Was that what was happening between her and Gabriel? This connection that had begun as shared understanding of loss, but had become something more vibrant, more alive? The possibility both exhilarated and terrified her. To open herself to love again was to make herself vulnerable to loss again. To allow herself to care for Gabriel, to love him, if she was honest with herself, was to risk watching him too be taken from her. Could she bear it? Could she survive another loss if the town's dark predictions came true? If her supposed curse followed her to the ridge and claimed Gabriel, as it had claimed the others she loved? But as sleep finally began to claim her, another thought emerged, clear and steady as the North Star. What if the town was wrong? What if there was no curse? What if, as Gabriel believed, she was simply a woman who had endured unimaginable tragedy but remained, at her core, unbroken? What if love, far from being dangerous, was the very thing that could heal them both? Morning arrived with clearing skies and a world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled in the sunlight like millions of tiny diamonds. Olivia woke to the scent of coffee and something sweet baking, to the sound of Gabriel moving about the kitchen below, to the knowledge that decisions waited that could no longer be postponed. When she descended the stairs, dressed in yesterday's clothes but with her hair freshly brushed and her resolve newly strengthened, she found Gabriel removing a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven. Claire's recipe. He had told her once, but adapted now with the extra cinnamon Olivia preferred. "Good morning," he said, looking up with a smile that warmed her more effectively than the fire crackling in the hearth. "I thought you might be hungry after yesterday's journey." "Starving," Olivia admitted, returning his smile as she moved. To help him, reaching for plates without being asked, finding forks in the drawer where they had always been kept. They ate at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the windows to create pools of gold on the worn wooden surface. The cinnamon rolls were perfect sweet, but not cloying, the dough light and tender. Olivia savored each bite, aware that this simple pleasure, this ordinary morning, represented everything she had once believed was forever beyond her reach. "The path should be passable by midday," Gabriel observed, glancing toward the window, "if you want to return to the valley today." Olivia heard the careful neutrality in his voice, the way he offered the information without revealing his own preference. She set down her fork, gathering courage for what she needed to say. "Gabriel," she began, "I've been thinking about the town, about what they say about me, about us." His eyes met hers, steady and patient, waiting for her to continue. "They believe I'll bring you harm," she said. "That whatever curse they think I carry will transfer to you. And part of me, the part that buried 4 babies and a husband, fears they might be right." Gabriel started to speak, but Olivia held up a hand, asking for his silence until she had finished. "But another part of me, the part that has sat at this table and laughed with you, that has cooked beside you and read books you've recommended and watched the stars from your porch, that part believes they're wrong. That part believes that what we've found here isn't doomed but blessed. That part wants—" She faltered, words failing her at this critical moment. "What does that part want, Olivia?" Gabriel asked gently. "A future," she whispered. "A future that includes this, you, us, whatever that might mean." Gabriel reached across the table and took her hand, his touch grounding her, steadying her. "Racing heart, I want that too," he said simply. "I have for some time. But the town has been wrong about many things," Gabriel interrupted, his voice firm. "They were wrong to make you an outcast. Wrong to blame you for tragedies beyond your control. Wrong to call natural grief a curse. He squeezed her hand gently. Let them talk, Olivia. Let them whisper behind their hands and predict doom. Their words have no power over us unless we give it to them. And if something happens? Olivia asked, voicing her deepest fear. If you fall ill or have an accident or will be, because illness and accidents are part of life, Gabriel said, not because you brought it upon me. He stood then, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet and around the table to stand before him. Even in her fear, Olivia was acutely aware of their proximity, of the way Gabriel's height made her feel simultaneously small and protected, of the warmth that radiated from him like a physical force. Olivia Sullivan, he said, his voice low and fervent, you are not a curse. You are not a harbinger of misfortune. You are a woman who has endured more sorrow than anyone should have to bear, and emerged with your capacity for kindness, for joy, for love still intact. That doesn't make you cursed. It makes you a miracle. The word struck Olivia like a physical blow. Miracle. No one had ever used such a word to describe her. No one had ever looked at her life and seen anything but tragedy, anything but something to fear or pity. A miracle, she repeated, testing the shape of it on her tongue. Yes, Gabriel affirmed, his hands moving to frame her face, his eyes never leaving hers. My miracle. The hand that brought vegetables to a lonely widower's door. The heart that recognized his grief because it matched her own. The woman who reminded me that life continues even after we think it's ended. You are not my curse, Olivia. You are my only blessing and hope. And then, with the winter sun creating a halo around them both, Gabriel Rhodes kissed Olivia Sullivan, not on the forehead this time, but on the lips, a kiss as gentle as new snow and as profound as the silence that follows. When they finally separated, Olivia felt as though something fundamental had shifted inside her, as if a burden she had carried for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her, had finally been set down. Stay, Gabriel whispered, his forehead resting against hers. Not just today. Not just when storms make the path impassable. Stay and help me make this house a home again. Stay and let me show you that life can still be beautiful, even after all you've lost. Olivia closed her eyes, breathed in the scent of him, wood smoke and coffee and cinnamon, and made the decision that would change everything. Yes, she sighed. Yes, I'll stay. News traveled swiftly through Pinehaven Valley, carried on the winter wind like seeds that would take root in fertile soil of gossip. Olivia Sullivan, the woman they called cursed, had not returned to her cottage. She had stayed on the ridge with Gabriel Rhodes, and not just for a night, but for days that stretched into weeks. Her cottage stood empty, smoke no longer rising from its chimney, the path to its door gradually disappearing beneath undisturbed snow. The whispers became a torrent. Some said Gabriel Rhodes had fallen under her spell, bewitched by whatever dark powers had claimed her babies and husband. Others, more charitable, suggested he had taken her in out of Christian pity, though they questioned the wisdom of such mercy. A few voices, quieter but growing stronger, wondered if perhaps they had been wrong about Olivia Sullivan all along. I saw her in town yesterday, Mrs. Finch told the women gathered for quilting at the church. Walking with Rhodes to the general store, she looked different. Different how? Demanded Mrs. Blackwood, her needle stabbing through fabric with unnecessary force. Mrs. Finch considered, her weathered face thoughtful. Alive, she said finally. She looked alive. The observation silenced the room momentarily. They had grown so accustomed to Olivia Sullivan moving through town like a shadow, had bowed beneath the weight of their judgment, that the image of her walking purposefully, perhaps even happily, required a shift in perspective few were prepared to make. It won't last, Mrs. Miller said firmly, breaking the silence. Mark my words. That woman brings death wherever she goes. Poor Mr. Rhodes just doesn't know it yet. But as winter began its slow surrender to spring, as February's bitter winds gave way to March's unpredictable thaws, Gabriel Rhodes showed no signs of falling victim to any curse. If anything, those who observed him noted a new vigor in his step, a fullness to his face that had been absent since his wife's death. The farmhouse on the ridge, which had stood as a monument to solitary grief for so long, now showed signs of renewed life, smoke constantly rising from the chimney, windows gleaming from recent washing, plans underway for spring planting that would require 2 pairs of hands. Olivia herself felt the transformation most keenly. Each morning she woke in the room that had once been Claire's sewing room, but had now become unquestionably hers, filled with her few belongings brought up from the cottage with wildflowers. Gabriel gathered for her even in winter, with books from his shelves that she was gradually working through. Each morning she listened to the sounds of Gabriel moving about the house, building the fire, grinding coffee beans, sometimes humming tunelessly as he worked, and marveled at the simple miracle of not being alone. The decision to move to the ridge had not been made lightly. Olivia understood what it would mean in the eyes of the town. A widow living unmarried with a widower would confirm every suspicion about her character, but weighed against the joy of Gabriel's company, against the healing she found in their shared days and conversations. The town's opinion seemed a small price to pay. They had established boundaries out of mutual respect, separate rooms, careful propriety despite the absence of witnesses. Gabriel had made it clear that while he hoped for a future that included marriage, he would follow Olivia's lead, waiting until she felt ready to formalize their relationship. The patience and consideration he showed touched Olivia deeply, further evidence that this man saw her not as damaged goods, but as someone worthy of care and respect. Their days fell into comfortable rhythm. Mornings spent planning the garden. They would plant when spring truly arrived, poring over seed catalogs Gabriel ordered from Boston, mapping out rows and deciding which vegetables would thrive in the ridge's shorter growing season. Afternoons often found them working side by side on the various repairs the farmhouse needed after years of minimal maintenance. Olivia sewing new curtains for windows, Gabriel had repaired, both of them repainting the kitchen a sunny yellow that made even gray days seem brighter. Evenings were devoted to quieter pursuits, reading by the fire, Gabriel teaching Olivia to play chess on a board that had belonged to his father, Olivia showing Gabriel how to knit, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needles once he mastered the basic motions. Some nights they talked for hours, filling in the vast territories of each other's lives that remained unexplored. Other nights they sat in comfortable silence, the presence of the other enough to make the evening complete. It was during one such quiet evening in late March, rain pattering against the windows as they sat before the fire, that Gabriel broached a subject they had thus far avoided. "Spring is coming," he said, looking up from the book he had been reading. "The valley will soon be in full bloom." Olivia nodded, setting aside her knitting, a scarf in deep blue wool that would complement Gabriel's eyes when finished. "I can feel it in the air. The quality of light is changing." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about the garden at your cottage, the one you tended so carefully. It will need attention soon if it's to thrive this year." The cottage. Olivia had thought of it less and less as the weeks passed, as the Ridge farmhouse began to feel more like home than the small stone building where she had spent so many solitary days. But Gabriel was right, the garden she had poured so much of herself into would soon be waking from winter dormancy, expecting the care she had always provided. "I've been thinking of selling it," she admitted. "The cottage. It holds too many memories." Gabriel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And if you did, what would you do with the proceeds?" Olivia hadn't considered this practical aspect. The cottage, while small, represented her only financial asset, the only thing Edward had been able to leave her after his debts were settled. I don't know, she said honestly. Save it, I suppose, for the future. Our future? Gabriel asked, the question gentle but direct. Olivia felt warmth rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the simple joy of being included in someone else's vision of what lay ahead. Yes, she said. Our future. Gabriel set his book aside and leaned forward, his expression serious. Olivia, I want to ask you something, and I want you to consider it carefully before answering. She nodded, her heart suddenly beating faster. Would you marry me? He asked simply. Not because of what the town thinks, not because of propriety, but because I love you and want to build a life with you. A real life with all its joys and sorrows, its challenges and triumphs. Though she had known this moment might come, had even hoped for it in the quiet corners of her heart, the reality of Gabriel's proposal, the directness of it, the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes momentarily robbed Olivia of speech. I know it hasn't been long, Gabriel continued when she remained silent. I know society would say we should wait, observe a longer period of mourning. But Olivia, I think we've both mourned enough to last several lifetimes. I think perhaps it's time to start living again. Living again. The words resonated within Olivia like a bell struck after years of silence. She had existed these past years, endured, survived. But had she lived? Had she allowed herself to embrace the possibility that life could still hold joy even after such devastating loss? Gabriel, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. Are you certain? The town already thinks I'm cursed. If you marry me, they'll say you're inviting tragedy into your life. If anything happened to you, nothing will happen to me that isn't meant to happen, Gabriel interrupted gently. Olivia, I've watched you these past months. I've seen how you care for living things, the garden you left behind, the plants you've started here, the wild birds you feed even when grain is scarce. I've seen how tenderly you handle Claire's possessions, honoring her memory while helping me move forward. These are not the actions of someone who brings death. These are the actions of someone who nurtures life wherever she finds it. He rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. You are not cursed, Olivia Sullivan. You are blessed with extraordinary strength, with the capacity to love even after love has cost you everything. And I would be honored to call you my wife, to face whatever the future holds with you beside me. Olivia looked down at their joined hands, his large and strong, hers smaller but equally capable. Hands that had cradled babies who didn't survive, hands that had planted gardens that thrived despite all odds. Hands that had found each other across a chasm of grief and built a bridge of understanding, of companionship, of love. Yes, she said, the word emerging as both declaration and promise. Yes, Gabriel Rhodes, I will marry you. The joy that transformed Gabriel's face was like sunrise, breaking over the ridge gradual at first, then blazing with unmistakable radiance. He rose, drawing her to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. When? He asked, his voice muffled against her hair. Olivia considered. Traditional mourning periods would suggest waiting, being circumspect, honoring the memory of Edward and Claire with extended solemnity. But hadn't they honored their departed loves in the best way possible, by finding the courage to open their hearts again? May, she decided, when the valley is in full bloom, when life is asserting itself everywhere we look. Gabriel drew back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. May it is, he agreed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of new beginnings. The news of their engagement spread through Pinehaven with the speed and force of the spring floods that swelled the valley's creek each year. Reactions varied widely, shock from those who had expected Gabriel to come to his senses and send the cursed woman back to her cottage. Vindication from those who had predicted this outcome as evidence of Olivia's supposed bewitchment, and from a growing minority, cautious approval. "They seem happy," observed Dr. Marshall, the town's physician, after encountering Olivia and Gabriel at the general store. "Happier than either has looked in years." "Happiness can be deceptive," countered Pastor Williams, though with less conviction than he might have shown months earlier. "Still, it's not our place to judge." "You said she was cursed," Mrs. Finch reminded him tartly. "Called it divine judgment when her babies died." "Seems to me that's the very definition of judging, Pastor." The conversation illustrated a subtle shift occurring in Pinehaven, a Comey willingness to question assumptions that had once seemed irrefutable, to consider that perhaps Olivia Sullivan had been victim rather than vessel of misfortune. The shift became even more pronounced when Olivia and Gabriel began preparations for their May wedding. Tradition dictated that such arrangements be handled by family, but neither had relatives in Pinehaven. In their absence, certain members of the community began to step forward, hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction. Dr. Marshall's wife, Elizabeth, was the first, arriving at the Ridge farmhouse one April morning with a basket of early spring flowers and an offer to help with wedding preparations. "I was thinking," she said as Olivia poured coffee for the three of them, "the church garden should be in full bloom by early May. It would make a lovely setting for a ceremony." Olivia and Gabriel exchanged surprised glances. Neither had considered the church as a potential venue, assuming Pastor Williams would refuse on principle. "You think Pastor Williams would allow it?" Gabriel asked diplomatically. Elizabeth Marshall smiled, a determined glint in her eye. "My husband delivered all three of the pastor's children. I believe he'll be amenable to persuasion." The visit marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, others from town made the journey up the ridge. Mrs. Finch with an offer to bake the wedding cake using her famous recipe. Mr. Miller, the general store owner, with fabric samples for a wedding dress. Even young Samuel Peterson, the blacksmith's apprentice, with a pair of hand-forged candlesticks as an early wedding gift. Each visitor brought not just practical offers of assistance, but the more valuable gift of acceptance, tentative at first, then increasingly genuine as they spent time with Olivia and Gabriel, observing the evident care between them, the peaceful atmosphere of the home they were creating together. "You know what I think?" Mrs. Finch declared to the quilting circle after her third visit to the Ridge. "I think we were wrong about Olivia Sullivan. Dead wrong. People don't just lose 4 babies without cause," Mrs. Blackwood protested, though with less conviction than before. "Actually they do," countered Elizabeth Marshall. "My husband has seen similar cases in his medical journals. Some women have a condition, something about the blood not clotting properly, or the womb not being shaped quite right. It's a medical issue, not a moral one, and certainly not a curse." The explanation, offered with the authority of the doctor's wife, provided a rational alternative to superstition, a way for the town to reconsider its treatment of Olivia without entirely admitting error. For Olivia herself, the gradual thawing of the town's hostility brought complicated emotions. Part of her wanted to reject their overtures, to protect herself from people who had caused her such pain. But a larger part recognized that bitterness, however justified, would only continue this cycle of isolation. And so she accepted each olive branch with cautious grace, allowing herself to hope that genuine reconciliation might be possible. As May approached, the Ridge farmhouse underwent a transformation that mirrored the renewal happening in the valley below. Fresh paint brightened rooms that had been neglected, new curtains hung at windows thrown open to spring breezes, furniture was rearranged to accommodate 2 lives merging into one shared existence. The most significant change occurred in what had been Claire's sewing room, the space Olivia had occupied since coming to the Ridge. With quiet ceremony, Gabriel helped Olivia move her belongings to the master bedroom, a room he had not shared since his wife's death. "Are you sure?" Olivia asked as they stood in the doorway together, aware of the significance of this transition. Gabriel nodded, his expression peaceful. Claire would want this room filled with life again, he said. She would want us to build our marriage on the foundation of what came before, not try to erase it. It was this approach, honoring the past while embracing the future, that defined their preparation for marriage. Neither attempted to replace what had been lost. Instead, they created something new that incorporated elements of their previous lives while establishing traditions unique to their union. One such tradition began almost by accident. During their evening walks around the property, planning the gardens they would plant and the improvements they would make, Olivia and Gabriel fell into the habit of sharing memories of Edward and Claire, not with the aching grief that had once accompanied such recollections, but with affection and sometimes even laughter. Edward once tried to surprise me by cooking dinner, Olivia recalled as they walked along the ridge one evening. The valley spread before them in shades of new green. He was so proud of himself, but he'd confused sugar and salt. The potatoes were inedible, but I ate them anyway because he looked so hopeful. Gabriel laughed, the sound carrying across the open fields. Claire was equally hopeless in the kitchen. She could play Mozart from memory, but couldn't boil an egg without creating a disaster. The first time she tried to make bread, it was so heavy we could have used it as a doorstop. These exchanges, far from diminishing their growing love for each other, deepened it, creating a space where all parts of themselves, including their past attachments, could exist without contradiction or jealousy. As the wedding day approached, preparations accelerated. The church garden, as Elizabeth Marshall had predicted, burst into bloom, tulips and daffodils, creating a riot of color against the white clapboard of the building. Inside, pews were polished and arrangements of wildflowers placed at intervals, transforming the austere space into one of natural celebration. The wedding dress, sewn by a committee of women led by Mrs. Finch, incorporated lace from Olivia's first wedding dress with new fabric in a shade of blue that matched the spring sky. The gesture acknowledging her past while celebrating her future touched Olivia deeply, evidence that at least some in town had moved beyond seeing her as the cursed woman. On the morning of the wedding, Olivia woke before dawn, watching as the first light painted the ridge in shades of gold and rose. Gabriel, honoring tradition despite their untraditional circumstances, had spent the night in town with Dr. Marshall, leaving Olivia alone in the farmhouse for the first time in months. The solitude felt strange after so many days of shared space, shared conversation, shared life. But it also provided a moment of reflection, of gathering herself for the step she was about to take. 5 years ago, she had buried her fourth child, and believed happiness would never again be possible. 3 years ago, she had buried her husband and resigned herself to a life of isolation and judgment. Even 6 months ago, she had moved through Pinehaven like a ghost, defined by tragedy rather than possibility. Today, she would become Olivia Rhodes, not erasing who she had been as Olivia Sullivan, mother to 4 children who had never had the chance to grow, wife to a man taken too soon, but adding to that identity, expanding it to include this new chapter that had seemed impossible until Gabriel had looked at her and seen not a curse but a blessing. As she dressed for the ceremony, assisted by Elizabeth Marshall and, surprisingly, Mrs. Finch, Olivia felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the future held, joy or sorrow, ease or hardship, she would face it not alone, but with a partner who understood the price of love and considered it worth paying nonetheless. The small church was fuller than Olivia had expected when she arrived, escorted by Dr. Marshall in the absence of family. Familiar faces filled the pews, some still wary, others openly supportive, all bearing witness to this unlikely union that defied the town's darkest predictions. At the altar, Gabriel waited, tall and steady in a new suit, his storm-gray eyes finding hers the moment she appeared in the doorway. The love in his gaze, clear, unafraid, absolute, gave Olivia the courage to walk the length of the church, past those who had once crossed the street to avoid her, toward the future they would build together. Pastor Williams, who had initially resisted performing the ceremony, conducted the service with unexpected warmth, speaking of second chances and redemption in ways that seemed directed not just at the couple before him but at the community that had so misjudged one of its own. When it came time for the vows, Gabriel took Olivia's hands in his voice steady and sure. "Olivia Sullivan, I take you as my wife, knowing that love comes with no guarantees. I promise to walk beside you through whatever life brings joy and sorrow, abundance and hardship, health and illness. I promise to see you always as I see you today, not as someone marked by tragedy, but as someone who has shown extraordinary courage in continuing to open your heart despite all it has cost. You." His voice dropped slightly, becoming more intimate, though still audible to those gathered. "You are not my second choice or my consolation prize. You are my deliberate choice, my only blessing, my greatest hope. And I will spend the rest of my days grateful that our broken paths led us to each other." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she began her own vows, her voice soft but unwavering. "Gabriel Rhodes, I take you as my husband, knowing that happiness is not a certainty, but a choice we make each day. I promise to build a life with you that honors what has been lost while celebrating what has been found. I promise to trust in possibility again, to believe that love, even when it ends in loss, is always worth the risk." She squeezed his hands gently, drawing strength from his steadfast presence. "You saw me when others looked away. You heard me when others refused to listen. You believed in me when even I had lost faith. For that, and for 1,000 other reasons, I give you my heart, my trust, and my future, whatever it may hold." As Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, as Gabriel kissed her with a tenderness that made several women in the congregation dab at their eyes, Olivia felt something settle within her, not the elimination of grief, which would always be part of who she was, but the addition of joy, which she had thought forever beyond her reach. The celebration that followed at the Ridge farmhouse, the first gathering of such size, the property had seen since Gabriel and Claire had hosted a harvest festival in happier days, reflected the complicated but genuine reconciliation occurring between Olivia and the town that had once shunned her. There were awkward moments, to be sure, conversations that faltered when they ventured too near painful subjects, silences that stretched a beat too long when certain townspeople found themselves face to face with the woman they had so grievously misjudged. But there were also moments of sincere connection, Mrs. Finch proudly serving her famous cake, Dr. Marshall raising a toast to new beginnings and second chances, young children who had once been hurried past Olivia now presenting her with wildflowers gathered from the ridge. As evening approached and guests began the journey back to the valley, Olivia and Gabriel stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching as lanterns bobbed like fireflies down the winding path. "Are you happy?" Gabriel asked, his arm around her waist, his voice holding genuine curiosity rather than doubt. Olivia considered the question seriously, understanding its weight given all they had endured to reach this point. "Yes," she said finally. "Not with the uncomplicated happiness I might have known before. Everything, but with a deeper kind. I think the kind that knows joy is more precious for being rare, more valuable for being hard-won." Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful as he gazed out over the valley where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "I think that's the only kind of happiness available to people like us," he said. "People who have seen the worst life can offer and still chosen to embrace what's left. It's not innocent or untested, but perhaps it's more durable for that." Olivia leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence, from the reality of this man who had redefined what was possible in her life. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Gabriel's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Now we live, Olivia, day by day, season by season. We plant gardens and watch them grow. We make this house more fully ours while honoring those who came before. We find moments of joy where we can and face difficulties when we must. Together. Together. The word held such power, such promise. After years of facing grief alone, of carrying the weight of loss and judgment without support, the simple reality of standing beside someone who chose her, who saw her completely and loved her anyway, felt like the miracle Gabriel had named. As darkness settled over the ridge and the valley below, as stars emerged in a sky vast enough to hold both beauty and pain, Olivia Rhodes turned toward her future, not with blind optimism, but with clear-eyed hope, not with certainty that all would be well, but with the knowledge that whatever came, she would no longer face it alone. In a town that had once called her cursed, in a life that had seemed defined by loss, she had found an unexpected truth, that broken hearts, like broken ground, could still nurture new growth. That endings, however painful, could become beginnings. If one had the courage to turn the page, that love, even when it risked further loss, remained the only blessing worth seeking, the only hope worth holding. Summer spread across Pinehaven Valley like a benediction, bringing long golden days and the sweet scent of wildflowers to the ridge where Olivia and Gabriel Rhodes had begun their shared life. The gardens they had planned through winter's confinement now flourished under their combined care, vegetables growing in neat rows behind the farmhouse, flower beds blooming in a riot of color along the pathways, berry bushes heavy with fruit, ripening in the summer sun. In these first months of marriage, Olivia discovered a rhythm to their days that felt both miraculous and ordinary. Each morning they rose with the sun, sharing coffee on the porch as they watched dawnlight spill. Across the valley below, Gabriel would tend to the small flock of sheep he had recently acquired, the beginning of the herd he had once envisioned with Claire, while Olivia gathered eggs from the chickens and harvested whatever the garden offered that day. Afternoons found them working side by side on the endless projects the farmhouse and land required: mending fences, repairing the barn roof, preserving summer's bounty for the winter ahead. Evenings were for quieter pursuits, reading aloud from books ordered from Boston, writing letters to Gabriel's sister in Philadelphia, who hoped to visit in the fall, planning improvements to the property that would make it truly theirs. In town, attitudes toward Olivia continued their gradual transformation. The wedding had marked a turning point, but true acceptance came more slowly, built through small interactions that accumulated over time. When Olivia and Gabriel brought EXESS produce to sell at the town market, customers who once would have avoided her stall now approached, albeit cautiously. When they attended Sunday services, fewer heads turned to stare, and more hands reached out in greeting. "Strange, isn't it, observed Mrs. Finch one Saturday as she stopped by their market stall to purchase green beans. "How quickly people forget their own certainties when faced with evidence to the contrary." Olivia smiled, recognizing the older woman's oblique reference to the town's former conviction that she was cursed. "People believe what helps them make sense of the world," she replied, without bitterness. "Sometimes it's easier to blame a curse than accept that tragedy can strike anyone, without reason or warning." Mrs. Finch studied her thoughtfully. "You've grown wise, Olivia Rhodes, and not just wise but kind. Not many would be so generous toward those who caused them such pain. Holding on to anger would only continue the curse they imagined." Olivia said simply, "I chose to set it down." This philosophy, choosing release over resentment, possibility over bitterness, had become central to Olivia's approach to life. She had not forgotten the pain of isolation, the cruel whispers, the averted gazes. But she had decided that her future would not be defined by the town's past treatment of her, just as it would not be defined solely by the losses she had endured. This decision was tested in late August when Mrs. Miller, the general store owner's wife and once one of her most vocal critics, arrived at the Ridge farmhouse unannounced, her face drawn with worry. "My daughter," she blurted before Olivia had even invited her inside. "Sarah, she's with child her first, but there's been bleeding. The doctor says she might lose it." I didn't know where else to turn. Olivia stood very still, absorbing both the request for help and its profound irony. This woman, who had once crossed the street to avoid the contagion of Olivia's supposed curse, was now seeking her guidance precisely because of her experience with pregnancy loss. "Come in," Olivia said finally. Stepping aside to allow Mrs. Miller into the kitchen, where preserving jars lined the counters, evidence of the summer harvest underway. "Tell me everything the doctor said." As Mrs. Miller described her daughters, condition spotting in the 4th month, cramping that came and went, the doctor's grim prognosis, Olivia recognized a familiar pattern that had preceded each of her own losses. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, a stone of memory that would never fully dissolve. "Has she been confined to bed?" Olivia asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath. Mrs. Miller nodded. The doctor insisted. "But she's..." Frantic with worry, convinced that every twinge means the baby is already lost. I thought you might speak with her. Help her prepare, whether for loss or for hope." The request was astonishing in its vulnerability, its tacit admission that Olivia possessed a wisdom born of suffering that might now serve others. It represented a complete reversal of how Mrs. Miller had once viewed her, no longer a vessel of misfortune, but a potential source of comfort and guidance. "I'll come," Olivia said simply. "Tomorrow morning." After Mrs. Miller left, Olivia stood at the kitchen window, watching the late summer light filter through maple leaves beginning to show hints of autumn gold. Gabriel found her there, still lost in thought, when he returned from checking the sheep in the upper pasture. "What is it?" he asked, immediately sensing her disturbance. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." Olivia turned to him, her expression a complex mixture of pain, wonder, and resolve. "Not a ghost," she said. "A opportunity, I think. Though one I never imagined would come my way." She explained Mrs. Miller's visit and request. Watching Gabriel's face register the same recognition of irony, the same subtle shift between past and present. "Will you go?" he asked when she had finished. "Yes," Olivia said, certainty growing. As she spoke, "If my experience can help another woman face what might be coming, how could I refuse? The pain I endured. Perhaps it can serve some purpose beyond mere suffering." Gabriel crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his eyes full of the steady admiration that never failed to strengthen her. "You continue to astonish me," he said softly. "Most would use such an opportunity to remind Mrs. Miller of her past cruelty, to extract some acknowledgement of wrongdoing before offering help." Olivia shook her head. What would that accomplish, besides making a frightened grandmother feel worse? Sarah needs support now, not a reckoning for her mother's past behavior. The next morning, Olivia rode into town with Gabriel, who had business at the general store but would wait to accompany her home afterward. The Miller house stood on the north end of Main Street, a well-kept 2-story home with white shutters and a front garden now showing signs of neglect. Mrs. Miller met her at the door, anxiety evident in every line of her face. "Thank you for coming," she said, the words clearly difficult for a woman unaccustomed to expressing gratitude to someone she had once shunned. "Sarah's upstairs. She knows who you are, what you've experienced." Olivia nodded, understanding all that remained unspoken in this exchange. She followed Mrs. Miller up the narrow staircase to a bedroom at the back of the house, sunlight streaming through lace curtains to illuminate a young woman propped against pillows, her face pale with fear and uncertainty. "Mrs. Rhodes is here to see you," Mrs. Miller announced, her voice gentler than Olivia had ever heard it. "I'll bring up some tea." Left alone with Sarah Miller Thompson, newly married at 20 and facing the possible loss of her first child, Olivia felt a momentary hesitation. What wisdom could she possibly offer that would ease this young woman's fear? What comfort could come from her own history of loss? But as she moved to sit in the chair beside the bed, as Sarah's frightened eyes met hers, Olivia found that words came naturally, not platitudes or false reassurances, but honest acknowledgement of the precariousness of this moment. Your mother told me what's happening, she began, her voice calm and direct. I won't tell you not to worry, because that would be both impossible and insulting to what you're feeling right now. Instead, I'll tell you that whatever happens in the coming days, whether this baby stays or goes, you will survive it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. How did you do it? Lose 4 babies and still function? Still want to live? The question was raw, desperate, and Olivia answered with equal honesty. One breath at a time, one moment, then the next. Sometimes it was all I could do to get through a single hour. But gradually those hours became days, the days became weeks. Life continued, even when I thought it shouldn't, even when I wasn't. Sure, I wanted it to. And now? Sarah asked, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat abdomen. Are you happy? Olivia considered the young woman before her, recognizing in her the same desperate need for reassurance that life could continue, could even flourish after devastating loss. Yes, she said simply. Not because I've forgotten my babies, I never will. Not because the pain has disappeared completely, it hasn't. But because I've learned that grief and joy can coexist, that loss doesn't prevent new beginnings, that the heart can be both broken and full at the same time. Over the next 2 hours, as Mrs. Miller brought tea and then tactfully withdrew, Olivia shared practical advice about bed rest, about nutrition that might help sustain a threatened pregnancy, about signs that would indicate the need for immediate medical attention. But more importantly, she listened as Sarah poured out her fears, not just of losing this baby, but of being defined by such a loss, of carrying its shadow into all her future days. If the worst happens, Sarah whispered, will people think I'm cursed too? Will they look at me the way they looked at you? The question pierced Olivia's heart with its innocent cruelty, its reminder of how thoroughly the town's perception had once shaped her existence. No, she said firmly. Times are changing. Dr. Marshall understands now that what happened to me, what might happen to you, has medical causes, not spiritual ones. And if anyone dares suggest otherwise, you send them to me. The authority in Olivia's voice, the straightforward strength born from her journey through grief and isolation to the life she now lived, seemed to reassure Sarah more than any medical advice could have. By the time Olivia prepared to leave, some color had returned to the young woman's cheeks, and her eyes, while still fearful, held a new determination. Thank you, Sarah said as Olivia gathered her shawl. For coming, for being so honest. Everyone else just tells me to pray and not worry, as if that were possible. Prayer has its place, Olivia replied, but so does practical knowledge. And sometimes, the most powerful medicine is simply knowing you're not alone, that others have walked this path before you and found their way through the darkness. As Olivia descended the stairs, she found Mrs. Miller waiting in the front parlor, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. How is she? The older woman asked, standing as Olivia entered. Frightened, but stronger than she realizes, Olivia said. She needs rest, good food, and people around her who acknowledge her fears without feeding them. The next few days will tell us more. Mrs. Miller nodded, then hesitated, clearly struggling with something more she wanted to say. Olivia waited, neither prompting nor retreating. I was wrong about you, Mrs. Miller said finally, the words emerging with difficulty. We all were. What I once called a curse was simply life. Cruel, random life that sometimes takes what we most cherish. I'm sorry for adding to your burden when it was already more than anyone should have to bear. The apology, unexpected and unasked for, washed over Olivia like cool water on a wound long exposed to air. She had not realized how much she had needed to hear these words, not just from Mrs. Miller, but from all of Pinehaven, until they were finally spoken aloud. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a great deal." As she left the Miller house, as she met Gabriel waiting patiently outside the general store, Olivia felt a shift within herself, as if something sharp-edged that she had been carrying had finally been set down, making space for new possibilities. "How was it?" Gabriel asked as they began the journey back to the ridge. Olivia considered the question, sorting through the complex emotions the morning had evoked. "Healing," she said finally. "For Sarah, I hope. But unexpectedly for me as well." She recounted Mrs. Miller's apology, the significance of it breaking over her anew as she spoke the words aloud. "It doesn't erase what happened," she concluded. "The isolation, the whispers, the way they all stepped back as if misfortune were contagious. But it creates a bridge between then and now, an acknowledgement that allows for something new to grow in its place." Gabriel nodded, understanding as always the layers beneath her words. Sometimes the most powerful form of healing comes not from forgetting the wound, but from having it finally recognized by those who caused it. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching twilight settle over the valley, Gabriel brought up a subject they had discussed only obliquely since there. Marriage, the possibility of children of their own. "Today with Sarah," he began carefully, "did it make you think about possibilities for us?" Olivia's hand found his in the gathering darkness, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "I think about it often," she admitted. "The possibility of trying again. The terror of experiencing another loss. The hope of a different outcome." They had been careful these first months of marriage, using methods Gabriel's sister had discreetly explained in letters, not from fear of conception itself, but from a mutual desire to establish their relationship fully before adding the complication and risk of pregnancy. "And what have you decided?" Gabriel asked, his voice gentle but direct. Olivia gazed out at the darkening landscape, at the home they had created together from the broken pieces of their previous lives. "That fear is a poor compass for navigating life," she said slowly. "That loss, while always possible, is not inevitable. That love justifies risk every time." She turned to him, finding his face in the last light of day. "I want to try, Gabriel. Not because I need a child to feel complete. You've shown me that life can be rich and meaningful without children. But because I believe that what we've built together is strong enough to weather whatever comes, joy or sorrow, fulfillment or disappointment." The smile that transformed Gabriel's face contained everything she treasured about him: his steadiness, his capacity for hope despite knowing its cost, his unwavering belief in the life they were creating together. "Then we'll try," he said. "Simply, and whatever happens, we'll face it together." That night, as summer crickets sang outside their window and moonlight painted silver patterns across their bed, Olivia and Gabriel loved each other with a new intentionality, not just the expression of their bond, but an opening to possibility, a declaration of faith in a future neither could predict, but both chose to embrace. Autumn came to Pinehaven Valley in a blaze of color, maples and oaks on the ridge, transforming from green to gold, crimson, and russet almost overnight. The farmhouse preparations for winter took on fresh urgency, the woodshed filled to capacity. Preserves lined in neat rows in the cellar, sheep brought down from the high pastures to fields closer to the barn. In late September, Gabriel's sister Madeline arrived from Philadelphia for a long-promised visit, bringing with her city fashions, news of the wider world, and a warmth that immediately endeared her to Olivia. The two women formed a quick bond, spending long afternoons in the kitchen exchanging recipes and stories while Gabriel completed the harvest work that couldn't be postponed. "He's different with you," Madeline observed one evening as they prepared dinner together. "Lighter. When Claire died, I thought part of him died with her. I never expected to see him truly alive again." Olivia glanced out the window to where Gabriel could be seen splitting wood in the yard, his movements rhythmic and sure, occasionally pausing to scratch the ears of the farm dog that had adopted them in early summer. "We both came back from a kind of death," she said thoughtfully. "Not by forgetting what we lost, but by discovering that the capacity for joy doesn't diminish just because we've experienced its opposite." Madeline studied her with frank curiosity. "Gabriel told me what the town believed about you, that they called you cursed." Olivia's hands stilled momentarily as she sliced carrots, then resumed their steady motion. "They did. For a long time, I half believed it myself. And now? Now I understand that what happened to my babies, to Edward, it wasn't a curse or a punishment. It was simply the randomness of life, the cruelty of chance. Bad things happen to good people every day, for no reason at all. The true curse would be allowing those events to prevent me from living fully in whatever time remains." Madeline's eyes were warm with approval and something like admiration. "No wonder my brother loves you," she said softly. "You've faced the worst life can offer and emerged with wisdom instead of bitterness. That's rare, Olivia, rarer than you might realize." The visit stretched from its planned week into nearly a month, Madeline clearly reluctant to return to city life after discovering the peace and purpose of the Ridge Farm. It was during her final week with them, as October painted the valley in ever more vibrant hues, that Olivia first suspected what might be happening within her own body. The signs were subtle at first, a new sensitivity to smells, a weariness that descended in mid-afternoon, a tenderness that made her wince when she bumped against the kitchen counter. She said nothing, not even to Gabriel, remembering too well how hope had blossomed and withered 4 times before. But as the days passed and her monthly cycle, always regular as clockwork, failed to appear, the possibility became too insistent to ignore. One morning, while Gabriel took Madeline to town to purchase supplies for her journey home, Olivia walked the short distance to the family cemetery where Claire Rhodes was buried in a peaceful corner of the property. The small headstone, inscribed simply with Claire's name and dates, had been kept free of encroaching weeds, evidence of Gabriel's continued care for the woman who had been his first love. Olivia had visited this spot several times since coming to the Ridge, initially with trepidation, later with a sense of connection to the woman whose absence had created the space for her own presence in Gabriel's life. Today, she came with news she could not yet share with anyone living. "I think I'm carrying a child," she said aloud, her voice soft in the autumn stillness. "Gabriel's child, our child." The words hung in the clear October air, both momentous and ordinary, the most natural development in the world and simultaneously, given her history, the most terrifying. "I'm afraid," Olivia continued, finding unexpected relief in articulating the fear she had been carrying. "Not just of losing this baby, though that fear is there, but of what it might do to Gabriel if history repeats itself. He's already lost so much. I couldn't bear to be the one who brings more grief into his life." A breeze stirred the fallen leaves around the grave, creating a gentle rustling that seemed almost like a response. Olivia wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, finding comfort in the soft wool Gabriel had given her as a wedding gift. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, feeling slightly foolish but compelled to continue nonetheless. "But if you can, I want you to know that I'm trying to be worthy of the life I now share with Gabriel, of the love he gives so generously. If this child comes to be, I promise to raise it knowing about you, about the foundation of love you and Gabriel built that made our own love possible." As she spoke the promise aloud, Olivia felt something shift within her, not the physical movement of the child that might be growing, still far too small for such sensation, but a settling of her spirit, a quiet resolve replacing the initial panic. Whatever happened in the coming months, whether this pregnancy progressed normally or ended in loss like those before it, she would face it with the strength she had built through suffering, with the support Gabriel unfailingly provided, with the wisdom that came from understanding that neither joy nor sorrow was ever permanent or complete. When Gabriel and Madeline returned from town that afternoon, laden with packages and news of Sarah Miller Thompson, whose pregnancy had stabilized. After that frightening start, Olivia met them on the porch, her decision made. "I need to speak with you," she told Gabriel after Madeline tactfully excused herself to rest before dinner. "Alone." Concern immediately crossed his face. "Is something wrong?" Olivia shook her head, leading him to the wooden bench beneath. The ancient maple that crowned their yard, its leaves now a brilliant symphony of red and gold catching the late afternoon light. "Not wrong," she said as they sat, "but significant. Life-changing, potentially." Gabriel waited, patient as always, his steady presence giving her the courage to speak, the words that might lead to either immense joy or devastating disappointment. "I believe I'm with child," Olivia said simply, watching his face as understanding dawned. "It's too early to be certain. And given my history—" She didn't need to complete the thought. Gabriel knew her past as intimately as she knew his, understood the layers of hope and fear this announcement contained. "Olivia," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. His hand found hers, gripping, with a strength that anchored her against the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm them both. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without medical confirmation," she replied. "My courses are late. There are other signs as well." Gabriel's free hand moved tentatively toward her still flat abdomen, hesitating just short of contact. "May I?" The request, so respectful of her body and its boundaries, so cognizant of the complex emotions this potential pregnancy evoked, filled Olivia with a rush of love for this man who continued to astonish her with his sensitivity. "Yes," she whispered, guiding his hand to rest against her midsection, warm through the fabric of her dress. For a long moment, they sat in silence, connected by touch and the possibility of new life growing where there had once been only loss. When Gabriel finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion but clear in its conviction. "Whatever happens, Olivia, whether this child stays with us or joins your others in heaven, know this. You have already given me more joy than I ever expected to find again. This potential child is a gift, but you are the miracle that made it possible." Tears filled Olivia's eyes at words that seemed to answer exactly the fears she had confessed to Claire's headstone just hours before. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of hoping too much, of disappointing you if—" "Listen to me," Gabriel interrupted gently but firmly. "There is no outcome here that would make me love you less or regret a single moment of our life together. If we are blessed with a child, I will be overjoyed. If we are not, I will still count myself the most fortunate of men for having you as my wife. You are enough, Olivia. You have always been enough." As the sun began its descent behind the western ridge, painting the valley in hues of amber and rose, Olivia leaned against Gabriel's solid shoulder, his arm around her a protection against the growing evening chill. The future stretched before them, unknowable in its details, but certain in its foundation. The love they had built from broken pieces, the life they had crafted from remnants of what had come before. Whatever this pregnancy might bring, joy or sorrow, fulfillment or loss, they would face it as they had faced everything since finding each other, together, with courage born of having already survived the worst life could offer, with hope, tempered by experience but no less genuine for its restraint. The woman once called cursed and the widower who had named her as blessing sat quietly as twilight settled over Pinehaven Valley, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, tiny points of light, distant but unwavering, much like the hope they now allowed themselves to nurture. "One day at a time," Olivia murmured, "both promise and prayer. One moment at a time." Gabriel's arm tightened around her shoulders, his voice a quiet affirmation in the gathering darkness. Together. And in that single word lay everything. They needed to face whatever lay ahead, the strength of connection, The courage of shared purpose, the simple, profound miracle of no longer being alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.